Translatese is a language that only translators and their clients are familiar with. It refers to a text that imitates the styles and idiosyncrasies of the source language. Even if nothing is grammatically incorrect or even if there's no explicit mistakes, it just sounds a little off. It just sounds a little overly literal. During my time as an editor at Academic Language Experts, I've had the opportunity to edit many translations and see the work of many different translators and editors. And something interesting I've noticed is that a good writer is not necessarily a good translator. Now, I believe that to be a good translator, first, you definitely need to be a good writer. At the end of the day, the service you're providing your client is a text, a good text that sounds good and readable and even native in the target language. But nevertheless, good writers, when they're faced with the task of translation, suddenly all kinds of translatees or literalisms sneak into their text. So that being a writer, even if it is a necessary condition for being a good translator, it's not a sufficient condition. There's something more to translation than just writing something from scratch. I think that the challenge of a translator is that we're expected to do the impossible. We're expected to remember the source text just enough to extract the content from it, but forget it enough so that it doesn't impose its influence on us. This is particularly difficult because the source text as we translate is salient in our minds. It kind of forces itself into our writing. And really, being a good translator is being able to overcome this challenge and avoid the harmful influence of the source language on our target text.
And what I find is useful is to think of specific actions, specific strategies we can take when we approach our source text. Ways to free ourselves of its entrapment. And some of those I'm going to present today. I just want to, the key word here is fluidity, which sounds like another way of saying don't translate literally, but it's more than that. It's a mindset. It's the way we think about the task, the craft of translation. Some people think of translation, if I can use another metaphor, of loading a house onto a moving truck and moving it somewhere else. I like to think of it like taking a wrecking ball, knocking the house down, picking up the pieces, and rebuilding it somewhere else. You have to take I like to take a destructive approach to the source text. You have to break down its format, its style, its structure. Because only once you've broken it down, and now you have building blocks that you can use, only then will you be able to create something new that sounds good in the target language. I'm talking generically here. Obviously, there's exceptions to this rule. I'm specifically talking about my field, which is more humanities, academic translations, in which the style is as important as the content, if not more important. I'm not an expert, but I would assume that doctors and lawyers don't always appreciate you taking creative liberties with their texts and translation. So obviously you have to know the context in which you're in. But assuming that you are translating something that does require a good style in the target language and in which transferring information is not the only thing you're trying to do, then some of these strategies, these are just things I've picked up in my time as a translator. Some of them may prove useful. Yes?
Like the marketing field, maybe?
Yeah, marketing is also a good, sorry, I'm thinking in my field. Yeah, marketing also, obviously if you make something sound odd in your target language, then You're not going to sell your product to the people you're trying to sell it to. So marketing, journalism, well, I don't know. Yeah, journalism, advertising, all those fields also. It's where the style is as important, if not more important, than the information. Okay, so let's begin. What I'm going to do is bring 3 examples of texts and their translations and say exactly what we're doing to the source text to get a translation which I consider good, at least. Again, I think this applies to a lot of different fields. I specifically come from the field of academic translations, specifically Jewish studies translation. So all the examples will be from Jewish studies, but the point is not understanding the content, it's more the form and style. Regardless, I'll make sure everything is clear. Okay, so let's start with our first example. Here's a relatively simple text that I encountered a few months ago. I'll read it. הרמב"ם כתב במשנה תורה את רקם ההיסטורי של המאורות הללו. Okay. Now, one way to approach this is to do what I call a linear translation, which is to look at this as just a series of phrases that I have to translate 1, 2, 3, 4. And you'll get something like this. Maimonides writes in his Mishneh Torah the historical background of these events. Okay. Technically, it's grammatically correct. Some of the modifiers could be in different places, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But it's the style is off. It doesn't sound, in my opinion at least, it doesn't sound right. And so we can take an approach which I'm going to call strategy 1, which is to play around with syntax. What I mean by syntax is the order in which we present different parts of the sentence. Most sentences are comprised of the sentence core, the main action. So in our case, it's the main action is the who, what, to what. So who, Maimonides, what is he doing? He's writing. And what is he writing? The historical background of these events. Everything else in the sentence is modifying that core sentence. And the thing I want to focus on is the Mishneh Torah. This is the modifier. This is the extra information. You could still have the sentence without that extra information, but does it have to be in this specific order? And that's the beauty of syntax and modifiers, is that often the order in which different parts of a sentence are presented is an issue not of meaning, but of style. And so this is a great opportunity for the translator to get in there and start moving things around. Don't follow it like a line. Think of it as a bunch of different building blocks that I have to reconstruct. So what would I propose is focusing on the Mishneh Torah, like I said. One thing we can do is put Mishneh Torah before the main action. Put it before the sentence, which is a common thing we do in English. But the point is, if you're focused on imitating the style of your source text, you're not going to think of that. Another option is...
Doesn't that indicate the Mishneh Torah is the most important thing as part of the sentence? As opposed to the Rambam?
So, not necessarily. This is something style guides talk about a lot, is how you should present the order of your information. I think, again, sorry, I forgot to mention the context here. The context here is talking about Maimonides when he presents the laws of Purim. He doesn't just say, read the Megillah, do this, do that. He explains the history of it. And where does he explain the history? It's in the Mishneh Torah. So in this specific context, the Mishneh Torah might be the most important thing we're talking about. It's all a matter of context. So again, another option, like I said, is to move it all the way to the end. The point here is I'm not saying one of these is right or wrong. The point is you need to have that on your radar, that as soon as you see a Hebrew sentence, you need to break it up into building blocks that you can move around. And that gives you a very important sense of fluidity. Something else that's... okay, well, new example. Hate dictionaries, which is my life philosophy as a translator, which is that dictionaries are very helpful for telling you, obviously, dual language dictionaries, like a Hebrew to English dictionary. they'll tell you what it means, and they'll help you understand the text. And if you translate completely based on dictionary definitions, and again, assuming you understand the grammar, you might come out with a perfectly fine sentence. It might be thoroughly accurate, but it might be terribly limited. And so in this sentence, we have the verb katav, pretty straightforward. I think we all know, besides whether it's writes or wrote or whatever, but otherwise, the verb write. Why not use that? You could, but of course, everything is a matter of context. And this is one of the superiorities of human translation over machine translation, is I know what we're talking about here. I know what Maimonides is doing. I'm not just looking at the single sentence. I know that he's discussing the laws of Purim, he's adding context, etc., etc. So is the point that he wrote, is the point that he took a pen and wrote on paper? No, I think there's a lot of other things going on here, and we can replace this verb with something that's not technically its definition, but still captures the idea. And so we can think of all kinds of different verbs here about the action that Maimonides is doing. He's including, he's incorporating, he's explaining, he's describing, he's providing. He's putting into his text something that we might not necessarily think is there. And the fact that the author wrote katav does not need to limit us to only translating it word for word. And this is what I call oblique word translation, is don't think of words as units with one specific or even 5 specific definitions. Think of them as constellations of ideas and associations. And you as the translator need to dive in there and try to figure out how different things connect and what the context is. Okay, let's move on to a slightly longer sentence. This is a sentence from Yeshaya Tishby's Introduction to Mishnah Zohar. And I think there's good examples. There's a translation, I forgot who does the translation, it will be in the other slides, but he won an award for it, the translator of this. I forget which award. But either way, the sentence reads as follows: זרות השפה הארמית ועומק תוכנו וסתימותו של הספר גרמו שעד היום נשאר הזוהר מעבר לאופק ראייתם של בני דורנו. Okay, pretty straightforward sentence. Now, what can we do to it? How can we approach it destructively? So, this brings us to strategy 3, which is to shift parts of speech. Or, as I like to call it, verb your nouns and noun your verbs. Just because the author chose to express something in a noun or as a verb or an adjective, whatever it is, there's always equivalence. There's a whole range of equivalence available. And which part of speech you pick is a matter of style, not always of meaning. So where do we see this in this example? So here we have an interesting case of conjunctioning your verbs. And the main verb here, the axis of the whole sentence is galmu. We have a subject and a predicate in this sentence. We have what? The zarut hasafa aramit. What is it doing? It's causing something. What is it causing? She'ad hayom nishar hazohar v'chule v'chule. The translator, however, decided to knock out the verb. We don't need to use a verb to express this causation idea. Instead, you can do this. At the beginning of the sentence, you can use because of. And that will convey the idea of causation without having to use a verb. Because of its strange Aramaic style and the depth and obscurity of its contents, the Zohar remains beyond the scope of Jews today. And this is the translator David Goldstein. Something besides replacing a verb for a conjunction here, this also shifts the whole structure of the sentence, which also represents another case of syntax change. Sorry?
We added the word Jews.
I'm getting to that, yeah. Whereas in the Hebrew sentence, the subject of the sentence was the Aramaic language. In other words, the sentence was subject, verb, predicate. In the English, this entire first part of the sentence before the comma has been relegated to a modifier. And now the main action in the sentence is over here. The Zohar remains beyond the scope of Jews today. And this is modifying that idea. again, these aren't right or wrong things. It's to have it on your radar. Whenever you see a verb, whenever you see a noun, whenever you see an adjective, is there room to shift it into another part of speech? And I find that really gives a lot of leeway when translating, if we keep that in mind.
Might it be appropriate to separate it into two separate sentences?
That might work. I will show an example of that in a second. Okay.
Hey, before you go to
Yes.
Why did you use instead of the Zarut, you made strange? It wouldn't be enough of its foreign Aramaic style?
So firstly, it's not my translation; it's somebody else's. But still,
Strange is kind of like
Strange?
literary, and somebody's chewing gum or something. And
maybe. So I was actually going to get to that, which is Zarut Safa Aramit. The way the translator rendered it was, like you said, because of its strange Aramaic style. Now, you're right, maybe it's foreign, it's unfamiliar, there's a lot of options here.
strange to everyone.
Okay. The point, though, that I wanted to focus on is not which adjective was used, but
specific instead of strange. Maybe.
that wasn't what I wanted to focus on, but that is a good point, is that an adjective was replaced for a noun. We could be talking about the strangeness or the foreignness of Aramaic, but do we need to? Instead, we can shift the sentence so that the subject is Aramaic, and then the strange, what was a noun here becomes an adjective here. Okay, one last thing in this example is Bnei Dorenu. Riatam shel Bnei Dorenu. Okay, so again, is this the dictionary definition of Bnei Dorenu? No, it's not. We could say the members of our generation, and I've honestly seen so many translations that use that, and it always annoys me. Right, exactly. That's right. Again, my point.
Ad Hayom, which includes people before our generation, no?
Um, yes, there are specific. Okay, I agree. These aren't. This is an existing translation, so I'm pointing out certain parts of it. I'm sure there's room for improvement, but my point is again simply that we don't need to use the dictionary definition. We can use a completely different word that conveys the same idea, though you are pointing out that it might not exactly convey the entire idea. Nevertheless, it's important to think in terms of context and not in terms of dictionary definition. And the Jews is localization, basically, because it's being pitched outside of Israel. Okay, our final example, and I'm gonna talk about some more of the examples that I mentioned before, and see some new things. And this is going to be a monster sentence. So this isn't a. Yeah, I agree. This is the type of sentence when you see it, you like pause for a second and you're like, whoa, okay, I need to take a coffee break. Like, so.
When we get the slides after.
If anybody who wants slides, you can ask me for them. I'll send them to you.
Okay.
בכיף. Let's try to take this on. הקבלה היא המיסטיקה היהודית אשר תתגלתה בין יחידים בסוף המאה ה-12, זכתה במיוחד הודות לעבודת חלוץ מחקרה בזמן המודרני, גרשום שלום, להכרה כבשר מבשרה של היהדות, שיש ללמד עניינה ובשורתה כדי להבין מקומה בתרבותנו, ולא לדחקה לשולי המחקר כתופעה מוזרה שראשיתה הזיה וסופה תעתועים. Okay, so yeah, I like the sound of the sentence. It does require you to pause and think for a moment. Sorry? It's a book by, sorry, I forgot to put that. It's a book by Zev Grease. I forget which exact book it is. But, okay. So what are some things we can do here? We're almost done. Don't worry. I know it's a formidable sentence. We also need more commas. That's true. So strategy 4, which is probably one of the most basic things that all translators know, but I thought I'd mention it either ways, is that you gotta break your sentences up. When you see a long sentence like that, especially when you're translating from Hebrew, which uses relatively few words, to English, which uses average 40% more words, you're going to get a sentence that takes up the whole page. So you can't do it. So you got to break it up. So the fact that the translator, here's the translation. The fact that the translator broke it up is not what's so interesting, but rather that what was parenthetical in the source text now becomes its own full-fledged idea in the target text. So instead of the whole Ki hamistika yehudit asher hitzgalta ben yechidim v'chulei, it's a modifier of Kabbalah, of what Kabbalah is. So what the translator did is said, you know what, this modifier is long enough that it can stand on its own. And that's exactly what he did. Kabbalah is the form of mysticism that developed among the Jews at the end of the 12th century. Great, we're done. We can now move on to the next idea. And recognizing that potential is important to see what modifiers can be turned into full-fledged sentences, and what sentences can be shortened in general. So it's important to think, the unit of translation, I would say, is the phrase, the modifier, the chords, breaking up your sentences into these small parts. Again, it's a way of thinking. Think of it as building blocks that you shift around. A sentence is very clunky. It's hard to work with. I want to talk about what I call strategy 5 here, is that when you say something is, then that sometimes implies what it isn't. Or in Hebrew, we sometimes say, mitoch lav ata shomea hen. So what we have here is that the source text tells us what Gershom Shalom accomplished. What did he accomplish? He stopped people pushing לדחוק את הקבלה לשולי המחקר כתופעה מוזרה וכו'. What that implies is that before he came along, that is exactly what people did. And so that's what our translator does. This is, again, it's a way of shifting the idea. You could argue that it's not completely equivalent, but I do think it's nevertheless important to have this fluid mindset so that the sentence sounds good in its source text. So, while long consigned to the margins of scholarship as a strange phenomenon, originating in hallucinations and culminating in illusions, it first tells us what was, and then Gershom Shalom comes along and changes that. It's a complete restructuring of the sentence and thinking about the implications of what the author is saying. Something else that's interesting here is another case of verbing your nouns. What is Kabbalah? People thought, Reshita hazaya v'sofa tatu'im. Now, straightforward translation is its beginning is hallucinations and its end is illusions. But you don't have to, because beginnings originate, and ends culminate. In other words, we shift those nouns into verbs, which in English, generally speaking, as a rule, but obviously depending on context, verbs are often better. They sound better. And so, again, this is an example of shift your parts of speech, have that fluid mindset. Strategy 6. How are we doing for time?
6 minutes.
Okay, fine.
What was the strategy 5?
Strategy 5 was mitoch lav ata shomea hen. Okay, so strategy 6, and I think I'll probably end with this, is you can't, if you're too beholden to your source text, then you're going to think that you have to make sure every single element of the text makes its way into your sentence. And there are clients, I've had clients who'll send me back a text and they're like, you didn't translate zachta. There's nothing reflecting it in the English. Okay, I try to convince them that you've got to sometimes express things different when you're translating. But here, these words, zachta b'miuchad, bizman hamoderni, they're just left out of the translation. And you could say that the translator failed in a sense by doing that, but I think that especially when you're dealing with such a complex sentence, sometimes you've just got to drop things, let them go, and...
I hope he doesn't mind.
Yeah, I hope they don't mind. I find leaving comments often helps. You say, I know this is your text, I thought that it would be better to remove A, B, C, and D, and often they appreciate that, and then they're like, great. Okay, what else? Fine. This is our final one. Strategy 7. Just because you can find an equivalent idiom doesn't mean you need to. What am I talking about? Yoshim Sholem made us realize that Kabbalah is b'sar mibsara shel yahadut, which is it's an idiom or a metaphor of it's the flesh and meat of Judaism. We could bend our minds trying to think of what the equivalent is in English. Like the thing that came to my mind is maybe the bread and butter of Judaism. There's probably better examples that one. Cornerstone, etc. And some of those might be good, and some of those might be good translations. But it's good to have in mind that you don't have to, because you pick idioms, you pick metaphors in your language because of the style you're trying to use. And that style is just simply not the same in your target language. And that's what the translator did. He said it's an integral part of Judaism. He didn't use the metaphor. He said, no, we don't need to use the metaphor. We're just going to say what the metaphor basically means, which is it's integral, it's an inseparable part of Judaism. Okay, I could go on forever, but I want everybody to have lunch. Yes.
Show us the former sentence, just because you can,
Sorry, just because you can find an equivalent idiom doesn't mean you need to. Okay. So I think some of the things I've said right now are maybe obvious to a lot of translators and are done intuitively, but some people have that talent. Just like a baseball player can hit a home run without knowing the laws of physics, some translators don't need to think about these things and they just do it naturally. But I always find that it's good to spell things out because sometimes it can help us understand the things we're doing intuitively anyways. And maybe for some people there was a thing here or there that was actually helpful. And I hope that I help people's translations somewhat. And good luck doing non-literal translations. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Fine. Yes, sir.
I think that what you taught us today should be included in the program of training the translators.
Of training the translators?
There's a lot of teaching value.
Thank you.
Because I'm also a licensed teacher.
Uh-huh.
And all that I see, for example, verb or noun,
Yeah.
teach gerunds,
Right.
which is a powerful tool.
Knowing grammar is very important and for good writing and for good translation.
It's also a matter of synthetic and analytical character.
Yeah, for sure.
What you call pre-syntax.
Yeah.
It's typical for Hebrew, which has more elements of more morphemes in the same word.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree.
As
It's
a teacher, it is important for me.
I never took translation studies. I don't know what they teach in translation studies. I would hope that some of these things are taught. But yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. The gentleman in the back, sir.
Yeah, you said the whole topic is meant to be literally.
Yeah.
Got the outstanding one here that every Tofa'ah in Hebrew becomes a phenomenon in English.
Yes.
You haven't even addressed that.
There's a lot of things.
Don't exist in English at the same extent as Tofa'ot exist in English.
That is very true. A lot of Hebrew writers, especially in academia, put tons of tofa'ot all over the place. I agree. I couldn't discuss every single example in every sentence, but thank you for bringing that up. Yes, ma'am? Yeah, you. Sorry. With the purple sweater. Yeah.
Well, you just addressed maybe only very quickly the fact that Hebrew has far fewer words than English.
Correct.
And in Hebrew, every word has double and triple and quadruple negatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, for instance, the idea that each word has an equivalent we've already discarded.
Mm-hmm.
But do you always have to use the same English word for the same Hebrew word? And that can very much expand your ability to improvise when you let go of the idea and you use a different English word which reflects the sense better in I mean, I'm not sure whether in your field
Mhm.
that is possible, but it's a very good strategy for expanding your options.
I agree with you 100%. This is also one of the reasons I don't like using machine translation, is even if you've given your machine translation a database based on your own translation, it will still assume that every time you have the same word, it should be the same translation.
Particularly from Hebrew, which actually has so few.
Exactly.
Those of us who work in other languages
Mhm.
are very much aware of it. And
Yeah.
the limitation, but it's also an advantage when you translate concepts.
Right. I definitely, in general, I think that there's a certain element of intuition here. I heard it would be popular to hate on machine translation, so I'm just going all out. Another thing when you have a machine translation is it gives you an idea of how to translate it. And even if it's right, but then you're locked into it. You can't forget that idea. You've just lost your ability to improvise. So I really think that you've got to look at a sentence, just go with your intuition, the first thing that pops into your head, and then later you can go back and fix things and fix up the stuff that you didn't quite get right. Yes?
There's one more strategy I want to humbly suggest, and that is sleep on it.
I was actually thinking of talking about that. When I said that it's very difficult to remember and forget something at the same time, there is one way to do it, which is wait a few days or sleep on it, and then you don't remember the source text anymore, so now you're just forced to look at your text that you've created, and then you're back to the status of being a writer or an editor. You can say, well, this doesn't sound good, why would I write that? But you can't do it in the moment, because you've still got the source language fresh in your mind. So yeah, thank you. That's one of my favorite. Yes?
I just want to say that you should give this to writers. I can't begin to tell you how many times somebody said, this isn't exact. Like, here, I work on it, and this is a work of art. But it's not a literal translation.
Yeah.
Well, for that, there's another strategy. Translate it into a language that the writer doesn't know.
Well, yeah, that always gives the most leeway.
Translate into Thai or Chinese.
When I started translating, Avi Stamen can tell you how that was. I realized that I was missing something and that I wasn't getting it right. And what I did is, and this is very nerdy, I sat and read style guides. I read like all kinds of different style guides for good writing. And that gave me a lot of insights into the way when you write an English sentence, you also have to play around with it. You also have to have that idea of free syntax. So everything I'm saying obviously just applies to writing in general. I just think in translation, you have to think of it much more concretely to overcome the influence of the source text. You got to think in terms of concrete strategies, in my opinion. Is that it? Okay, thank you.